Thank you, Carson. Thank you so much for having us, PESI. And I'm so grateful to be here with Isra and looking forward to this meaningful conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction, Carson. And Jessica, I am so glad to finally be chatting with you about this, about something that is so near and dear to my heart. And I know as therapists, this is something that most of us think about a lot, which is really the power of storytelling. Oftentimes, therapists, we say to others, we help people rewrite their stories and we learn your story so that you can feel more grounded in your story. There's so much storytelling that happens in our work. And I think it's because storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool for us to make sense of the world around us and of our experiences. And as somebody who works with specifically with a lot of South Asian clients, I can see how some cultural practices or expectations around silence and taboo and not talking about the thing, how much shame that brings up in people, sometimes generationally, right? And so I think that storytelling is an incredible venue or like method for actually attacking the shame so many people live under. And I know that this is something that you resonate with immensely as well. So, how do you kind of incorporate storytelling and how does that show up in your book and your broader work, especially when it comes to upending shame?
Yes. All right. Well, let's get into it. I'm going to start by sharing my background a little bit and therefore sharing my own story to sort of model what we're actually talking about doing and how it's helped me over the years. So, excuse me, I'm getting sick right now, everybody. So, I apologize for sounding a little off and blowing my nose. But we're going to get through this and it's going to be great. So, I'm a psychologist. I specialize in women's reproductive and maternal mental health, and I come to the field with a background in public health. I worked in international women's rights and women's health for several years before pursuing my PhD. And when I decided to go into clinical practice, my hope was to marry my background in public health with the clinical work. And at the time, my passion was purely theoretical. I was passionate about women's issues and passionate about the fact that I myself am a woman. I had not yet lived through anything specifically that informed my decision to go into reproductive and maternal mental health necessarily until I did. So, when I was 16 weeks into my second pregnancy, I had a miscarriage while I was home by myself. I was instructed by my doctor how to cut the umbilical cord and promptly began to hemorrhage as my husband was darting through LA traffic trying to get home to me. My doctor thought we should bring the fetus to her office in a bag. We got there as quickly as possible. And then to make matters all the more traumatic and dramatic and sort of documentary like, I ended up having to undergo an unmedicated DNC. So, the reason these details are so important is because when we share our stories, when we make them shinier or we, buffer out the things that we think might be triggering, we do ourselves a disservice and maybe those around us as well. This experience inevitably changed the course of my professional and personal life. I had been sitting for several years with women talking about their feelings surrounding miscarriage, pregnancy loss, stillbirth, terminating for medical reasons, fertility struggles, perinatal and postpartum mood and anxiety disorders. But until I went through it firsthand, it was theoretical. It was stuff I had read books about, conferences I had gone to. Suddenly, I was one of them and I could actually feel so much of the things they were talking about. So, oftentimes, and this is where the shame comes in, the silence begets the stigma, begets the shame. So I see it as this kind of strident trifecta where one begets the next, and keeps on swirling. And after my loss, I turned to the research and I was outraged to see the number of women who are blaming themselves for something they had no hand in and for feeling a sense of alienation, isolation from their communities, and feeling a sense of body failure. All of this to say, I could not help myself and ended up sort of getting on a soapbox about these issues and started the I Had a Miscarriage campaign in 2014 with my first New York Times piece. And it was, I mean, I sort of inadvertently started a movement. I didn't plan to start it. I just wanted to share my story so badly because I wanted to make a dent in the cultural conversation and lack thereof. People need to be compassionately, I think, invited to talk about the things that plague them, talk about the things they think are the unspeakable, talk about the very things that create this shame that can eat us alive. I'll stop talking.
No, I think
That was a long story.
but a very like vital one because not only is this just something you say and write and work about, like you're modeling it right here, right now, right? You didn't skip through the story to just get to, this is what I do because that's the
Right.
important piece, right? The
Yeah.
story is important. And the more
Right.
times we share the things that feel like we have, like the capacity to share, and I know we'll talk about capacity later on, and I'm so jazzed for that part of the conversation. But the more we have the capacity to share, it implicitly allows other people to share, right? And as you were speaking, first, like I mentioned, thank you for sharing that. I couldn't help but just kind of feel how women's issues are often so understudied that it takes someone to experience something who goes into this research rabbit hole as a way to make sense of what's going on with them. And I
Exactly.
think, that's the piece of your story that kind of I feel intersects with mine, which is I turned to the research when I was feeling completely overwhelmed and burnt out and tired, but didn't meet any criteria for any diagnosis. So I immediately knew that if it's not happening inside of me, it's happening outside of me. And what can I do and what can I learn? But when people go on these journeys, this is something I noticed as maybe you also felt it. But when we go on these journeys about going deeper into something that has happened to us that is lacking in the cultural discourse, I found the most common response, even from like well-meaning people, is that you're being too much.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
why can't you just get over it? It's too much. This is too much. You're being too sensitive. Like, you're making a bigger deal about this. So many other women have miscarriages. So many other people are burnt out, right? So that becomes the first barrier. And sometimes we ourselves internalize it. So
Mm-hmm.
we don't seek support and we essentially like tell ourselves to stop thinking what we're thinking, which is just not helpful advice to anyone.
Yeah.
You took like an opposite route. Not only did you go rabbit hole into the research, but you amplified what you learned through your work. So can you share just a little about that experience?
I will say that it's almost hard to remember because of it was such a blur. I felt honestly numb the day that my piece came out. So October 15th is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Day. And this was my piece where I was actually holding a sign that said hashtag I had a miscarriage. You couldn't see my face because I wanted people to be able to envision themselves holding this sign around the world. And the amount of messages I received, the amount of feedback saying, I had a miscarriage 15 years ago. I've never told anybody. Or I had a miscarriage 5 weeks ago and I feel so much shame and I hate my body. And why can everybody else have a baby, but I can't? I mean, on and on. And it was the most heartening, the most humbling, the most, I felt so privileged. But I also, being that inundated with feedback and information and realizing the risk, the vulnerability that was inherent in me sharing my story in such a big way. It was almost like too much for me to comprehend on the day that it went public and then viral. And maybe that's part of why it was so overwhelming. I didn't expect it to be such a big deal for other people. I thought, oh, I'm doing this for me, and I'm doing this to hopefully model for others that we can share the contents of our stories, and that we can ask ourselves, if we're not, hopping on a soapbox and sharing publicly, why are we not? Because I don't think, and I reiterate this in my book, Normalize It, you know, in no way do I think that every person needs to be public about their stories. I don't think everybody needs to get on Instagram or podcasts or whatever. We don't have to share with the whole world. My main concern is if people are being hush hush about something like pregnancy loss, what's the reasoning behind it? It's one thing if you're sort of a more private person and you want to keep it in the family, but I want people to at least investigate the reasoning behind it. Do you feel ashamed? Do you feel it was your fault? Is it because your, medical provider told you about the 12-week rule and that, it was probably it's not a good idea to share your good news because in case it becomes bad news, then nobody has to talk about it? Do you feel like you've been shaped by culture when it comes to talking about grief and you feel unentitled to talk about it and you're sort of rushing through the grief to be over it or to move forward or even to focus on the silver linings? Um, so that was my hope in opening up this conversation. And then I couldn't stop after that. And so I ended up writing tons of articles on various topics related to pregnancy loss and life after, which led to my first book project, um, which that book is called I Had a Miscarriage.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of themes to unpack there because this is it's like such a intersectional, complex web of mythology and shame and, you know, myths that we just believe about things that just gets tangled in somehow into our self-worth and our value as people and how we feel
Mhm.
about our bodies. But the
Yes.
shame piece is particularly powerful, is because shame is really hard to identify. Even for like the most, emotionally aware person, shame is so sneaky in that it finds its ways to cover itself behind so many things. So, I mean, you write a lot about this, you were writing a lot about it. You're a mental health professional yourself. But I just like wonder, did you yourself experience these feelings of shame? How did it even like, how were you like, huh? This is what I'm feeling, right? Can you just share
I'm
that?
so glad you asked. Yeah, thank you for asking me that
Yeah.
because I do think trying to get personal about it is important. Here's the thing. I did not feel shamed, like shameful at all. I did not feel a sense of self-blame. Now, the only reason though that I can figure why this happened in the way that it did is potentially because I had already had a healthy child and a very smooth pregnancy. So immediately after my miscarriage, I went to the place of, I'm pretty sure something had to be wrong with the fetus. Like me, I think something had to have been wrong. We will find out in 2 weeks. And we did, in fact, find out there was a chromosomal abnormality. So for me, that kind of scientific information was helpful. I didn't feel like my body failed me. In fact, I felt like it was proof my body was working. Did I wish that it worked sooner so that it wasn't such a trauma in my life and, didn't happen in the context of my home and, me having to actually be face to face with a fetus in my bathroom? I mean, it was unfathomable. Um, but I did not feel ashamed. I still have no shame about my miscarriage. This is why I couldn't stop writing about it because it's like, why? How are people feeling ashamed of something that they have no hand in? That that the research shows 80% of miscarriages happen due to chromosomal abnormalities. But then I hear women in my office going to the place of, maybe it was that sip of coffee that I had. Maybe it was the wine I had before I knew I was pregnant. Maybe, it was from having sex. Maybe it was, over exercise, whatever it was. And here's the thing, and I think you'll resonate with this. My sense is that when women get caught in, or maybe people in general get caught in this self-blame spiral, it's in part because they hope that next time, should they figure it out, they will have more control. So if it was the fact that I didn't eat enough blueberries in the pregnancy, next time I will, and therefore next time I will have a different outcome that, will lead to a healthy pregnancy.
Yeah, I think that's like a really important point to talk about is that self-blame in the moment as a coping skill gives us a false sense of control over a situation. And that's where shame becomes such a powerful motivator for changed behavior. The shame will drive you to avoid everything you thought was the hypothesis for the reason this happened. And it's like so strong, but also so distressing. But one of the things that kind of came up to me right now as you were speaking, first of all, I think it's pretty remarkable that you didn't have shame about this and you were armed with like a lot of information and knowledge. That's why I think talking about it is so important. The more we talk about something, the more knowledgeable we become, and that becomes like a protective thing for us. But
Yeah.
in order to talk about it anyway, to begin with, one of the things we often say as therapists is, make sure the environment you're disclosing in is safe.
Mhm.
So I wondered, as you were speaking, were there moments where other people were trying to shame you, making this environment unsafe, even though you're not feeling that shame? And,
Yeah.
what is that? How do we shift that?
Yes, 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 yes. So you're right. I mean, because I actually was not thinking about that piece of the puzzle when you asked about the shame, because so I did not feel shame for having my miscarriage. However, when people would say certain things to me in the aftermath of my loss, I was stunned. So the platitudes, all the things that begin with, at least, you can get pregnant, at least you're young, at least you have a healthy child, at least you have a thriving career. These are no-nos. These send women running for the hills. And this is another grave concern of mine. When we need support the most, we often feel the most isolated. Why? Because people are putting their feet in their mouth, saying these things that they think might be helpful or they think might be the right thing. And these are loving, these can be family members and friends. So they're well
Mhm.
meaning.
Yeah.
It can be so alienating. So I had an experience where I took my son to, or maybe I was picking him up from preschool just a week after my miscarriage. And I ran into a mom that I didn't know very well, but her kid was in my kid's class. And she said, "Oh my God, you look so good. It looks like you were never pregnant." And there were no words, right? So I'm just giving this example where people can say something that they think is truly a compliment. She meant to say, "You look great. And it looks like you never went through that horror." And she's hoping that therefore I don't feel like I went through that horror. But
Mhm.
what she doesn't understand is that I wish I was pregnant. In a way, I still wish I did look pregnant. It was troubling to me that I didn't look pregnant, on and on and on. So,
Yeah.
did those things make me feel ashamed? I think they made me feel silenced. I think they made me feel stigmatized. And I think they made me feel like I wanted to shut down and, you know, hide away, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know it probably took a lot of just emotional resilience to choose the opposite.
Mm,
Right, to literally do the opposite of shutting down and literally do the opposite of being silenced. And the thing about platitudes, it's so interesting because as someone like in my early 20s and my teenage years, this is something that I struggled with immensely, which is I just didn't know what to say. You know, if like I was in high school and early undergrad and someone was in the hospital, like I wouldn't even go to visit people because my shame of
mm,
not knowing how to talk about something, not knowing how to be there for someone, prevented me from connecting with someone who is struggling.
mm.
Many years later, I see how that was working in my young mind, but I think that's a really key part of the discussion is how do we actually equip the average person with the
Yeah.
emotional vocabulary and the language and the comfort to talk about these things?
Right. Wait. So do you think though that uh, part of the reason why you felt uncomfortable going to visit someone at the hospital had to do with cultural pressures, societal norms being what they are around grief and difficult conversations, and or familial, issues within the household where you grew up?
Yeah, I'll answer both of them. So culturally, it is like a very strong obligation to visit the sick. Both from like a South Asian culture, like that hospitality piece around people who are sick and being there for them is really, really important. Big point of the culture. The Muslim religion encourages you immensely to go and support people who are struggling, who are sick, who are at a loss of something like that. Recommendations are always take food for them, make sure they don't have to worry about, what they'll be eating, do their laundry. Like these are like recommendations in the cultural script. And my parents were very comfortable with this. They were the first people there if there was a loss, like with trays of food and taking
Mm,
laundry home and taking people's children into like it was a very like pro support culture during grief. But I
mm,
think I just struggled with the language around it because I was so cognizant that the language just never reflects the immense pain someone is feeling.
mm.
I always felt silly, you know? And that prevent,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Like it's like it won't measure up to the enormity or the profundity of what somebody is going through. So
yeah,
even if I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," it's like, is that enough? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. What's been
Interesting.
your like take on this?
Well, it's interesting. I feel like in the grief world, a lot of people seem to say that the onus should never be on the griever themselves. So I think that's an interesting point. I don't necessarily wholeheartedly agree, like, meaning we shouldn't ask the griever, "What can I do for you?" Or "Can I
Yeah.
stop by today?" Or "What is it that you need?" Instead, just do something. I think there can be a combination of both, honestly. That's my feeling and that's how I felt when I've gone through hard things. Like I don't necessarily want somebody just showing up, so it's kind of better if they reach out and ask what I need and what I want.
Hmm.
But I do think it's interesting. I think sometimes people can use it as kind of an excuse, not consciously necessarily. When they say, "Well, I just didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything at all." Or, what if she wasn't thinking about her loss,
Hmm.
and I bring it up and then I sort of put her back in that place or I trigger her, her mood goes south because of me.
Hmm.
And I just end up thinking, you know what? Hopefully, we're all adults. And so if you ask somebody, "How are you doing? How have you been feeling? I've been thinking about your loss," whatever it is you say, and the person doesn't want to talk about it, they'll tell you. But not asking means you're not acknowledging, you're not keeping in mind what they've been through. You're not sort of holding that space that so many people really need and want, whether they know it or not. And so if you were to say, "I know your miscarriage was a month ago. How are you doing?" And the person, you know, isn't thinking about it, which they probably are though, but if they're not, they could just say, "Thank you so much for asking. yeah, I know this isn't something that I want to talk about right now, but I appreciate it. So I think my point is that I think it's worth taking the risk of finding out by showing that we care. And there aren't perfect words, and sometimes we stumble and we fumble. And I look back before my miscarriage, I'm like, ooh, what did I say to people after their miscarriage? I definitely didn't say stuff like everything happens for a reason, God has a plan, like, trying to rush people through their grief. But I definitely didn't understand the complexity of the pain. So now, I mean, obviously in my work, it's one thing, but with friends and loved ones outside of the office, I try to be just there. I mean, I think being there, being present is not as hard as we think, or maybe it is, but we have to dare ourselves to do it anyway. I think it takes a certain level of vulnerability on our part and fortitude, you know,
Yeah.
and we also have to be okay with somebody shooing us away or not
Yeah.
wanting to talk about it. But then if we don't take that personally and we know, you know what, I let this person know I care about them. I'm here when they want to talk. If they want to turn to me, I am one of those people in their corner because too often, based on the complexity of grief, our culture just wants us to move on, shove it away, and not
Mm,
talk about it at all.
yeah. Yeah, I think that, adding to that a little bit, something that came up for me as you were talking about being present, and even when I think about like my younger self, who definitely was using this confusion around language as I think like just like an avoidance of like how scary it is to kind of sometimes, you get confronted with your own fears around things.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so you can kind of be like, oh, they don't want me to bother them. But what you're really doing is protecting yourself. But one thing that I found also to be helpful, like in my own journey and getting comfortable with this stuff, is sometimes parallel play can be very impactful for
Mhm.
someone who is, struggling with some kind of loss. Part of like talking about it and normalizing it is also just letting it be there in the context of you guys maybe being in the same room and working on other things, or maybe your friend is napping, but you're just working from home from their living room, just as a body,
Yeah.
doing errands together without necessarily talking about the thing, because that
Well,
can normalize their life in this new context. Um, and I think that that's to me like a very actionable way of making that happen.
yes.
Um,
I think
but
it's wonderful. Yep.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, no, it's just, I think that's a great idea and I think can be so helpful.
Yeah, I think that, just to close, and before we open up to questions, I see the chat has been very active, so I'm excited
Oh,
to hear
yeah.
what we've been talking about. But I think the thing I would love for you to share a little bit in closing is I th- at it's important for us to reclaim parts of our story, and that requires us to normalize talking about something.
Yeah.
What is your biggest hope out of this book that's coming out in a couple of weeks?
I think
Where do you
that,
want it to fit in the broader discourse?
oh, well, I gotta show it.
Yeah.
The finals just came. I'm so
Love
happy.
that.
Okay, well,
Congratulations.
you know what? I think I'm gonna read this and that kind of answers your question.
Yeah.
Every time we dare to talk about the hard things, we create ripple effects that ultimately help shape and shift the master narrative, the stigmas, the shoulds. In the face of this revolutionary zeitgeist shift, we have the chance to exist in the mess without feeling we are the mess. The truth is that living in the gray in between, away from the all or nothing, black and white binaries, might be the most challenging place to reside. This is the place of vulnerability. This is the place of openness and authenticity. Maybe that's why society tries so desperately to evade it. But it is perhaps the only place where we feel truly seen, truly understood, and truly ourselves. This may be the only place from which we can acknowledge the entire spectrum of our emotions and experiences, the place where we can lay it all out. No hiding, no pretending, no siphoning of feelings. This work is ongoing, messy, not always linear, but I am encouraged by one undeniable fact. All of those complex, often taboo, certainly historically overlooked experiences women endure, yeah, we're ready to talk about them all, and we're not stopping until they are all normalized.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that hopefully this is a message that resonates with a lot of people because the more we talk about something, the more we normalize it, the more you can actually enact positive change on what the issue was trying to suppress or oppress. And my hope with the work that you do is that it implicitly continues to provide permission to people to just embrace emotional honesty.
Mm.
And we just like never know the impact it can have. So even if you think, what's the point of me telling my story? Why, like, no one's actually listening to me? Sometimes the smallest shifts can have this like ripple effect across generations. You know, building insight in one person changes how they pass that on to the next generation. And so, we've learned the shame and stigma from the generations before us. And so now we get to be these points of pivot, in culture. And
Yep.
every single person, like you, and again, you don't have to get on Instagram to do it. You could talk to your neighbors. You could turn to the woman at like a clinic and normalize the experience you're both there for, right? Uh,
Yes.
and so I just want to, ask you one fun question, I guess, if you will. What's a truth that you're still learning to normalize in your own life?
Mm. My answer is not very fun. It's sort of dark.
Mm, okay, that's
Um, yeah, no, so I've been struggling with, so I went through breast cancer and I have to take this estrogen blocking medication that affects my energy level and sometimes my mood and my bones and my joints and all of it. And what I realized is when I first started taking it, all my friends and family would listen. Everybody sort of had different versions of either trying to like help or having suggestions of things I could try to do to feel better. I saw though, after, a certain amount of time, I guess the listening burnout maybe, or the reserves around holding space for me in this way, or just, or just listening to the fact that this remains something very difficult in my life because this is a 5 year experience for me. So it's not like temporary. I mean, it is, but not, it doesn't feel like it in the moment. So I'm trying to figure out how to normalize still talking about it with people who I feel safe with people who aren't going to try to fix it or change it or give me medical advice that they don't know anything about, um, so that I can continue to honor this experience for myself because it's very difficult and it can be very isolating as a result.
Yeah, I think that that's a very difficult experience to go through because it's like there's so much support and then it just like you feel like you're in a vacuum. And I think that does speak to perhaps some of the things that I was talking about earlier about people's own discomfort and avoidance, right?
Yes.
And so like the stigma that we have these like magical thinking moments where we're like, oh yeah, well, if this is their norm, they're probably like okay with it, like all of these things. So I
Yes.
think it's the more you do kind of share and continue to share, hopefully that changes the way people view what being there looks like as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, for
What
me,
about for you? Yeah.
the thing I'm really trying to normalize is that my body needs rest just like everybody else. Because I'm an overachiever, and even though I wrote a whole book on it, it's still like a work in progress, because we're all works in progress at all times. I sometimes tend to believe that other people need rest and I am somehow exceptional and I can, like, is
Yeah,
this distorted thinking, frankly. And so while I'm able to tap into rest now very frequently and much better than before, I recently got sick and it was that immediate, like, I was like, well, you don't need to sleep in when you're sick. Like, oh, but like, it's just like this, like, very
mm,
interesting
that
experience
is
of living, especially in the last 2 weeks. So I'm really trying to like normalize that for
that's
myself.
interesting. I actually thought you were going to say because I got sick, I had no other,
Mm,
option but to
mhm.
rest. But it's interesting that even being sick, you wanted to keep on keeping on. Yeah, I get
Yeah, I know. We're all like just trying to survive out here.
it. That is for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know as therapists, we hold so much space for other people all the time, and we hold so much space for people's stories and like the difficult emotions that they bring up. That's why taking care of ourselves and normalizing the challenges in our life becomes even more important because
Yes.
people tend to believe that therapists don't have feelings. Like we're somehow above and beyond that. And so
Exactly.
sometimes people in our life can treat us like that when we are having a harder time. So just stuff
Yeah.
to think
Good
about.
point.
I do want to invite Carson back because I know that we've got some questions. There's a very active chat happening on the side. We have about 20 minutes, so we'd love to hear from you.
All right. Amazing job, ladies. I'm loving this conversation. So I will take a peek here. Um, the first question that came in, and a couple people did thumbs up it. This is just a curious thought, but do you think this stigma and shame comes from our history of being founded by a puritanical ideology of sex is dirty and women are meant to be pure? That's the question.
Did we lose Isra? Did you go somewhere?
No, I'm right here. Did you want me to take a
Oh,
start?
I couldn't see you.
Oh,
Um,
I have thoughts, but I'd love to hear
yeah,
yours.
I don't know. I thought you'd have thoughts, so I'll let you take that one.
Sure.
I mean, the
Um,
answer is yes, but
I think it's like really challenging to tease apart exactly where the shame comes from because for sure there's a puritanical ideology, women are meant to be pure, but there's also this like historical idea that a woman's body is utilitarian. It's there for a purpose. We are like the channels of birthing and all that nonsense that is so deeply rooted in patriarchal societies across culture. There's also this idea that, I think in current day with what's happening with the rise of, the male loneliness epidemic and all of those things, you can see that there's a lot of mythology around like the feminine. And so we are just better able to handle our emotions. We are just better at supporting each other. Like we are just better at childcare and we are just better at all these things. Like there's so much myth out there about the truth of what it is to be a woman that so much of the shame is just an offshoot of that beyond just sex. I think it's sex plus all the other things.
All right, Jessica, did you want to take a stab at that one or should I go on?
no, that was perfectly put. Yeah, I don't have to say more there. Mhm.
Okay. One question was, could someone explain and expand on what neuroceptive safety is?
So I've never heard this phrase before.
I don't know what that is either.
Yeah.
Neuroceptive safety. I don't know.
And if that person wants to expand in the chat on what they're trying to get out of that, please type and we can look back at it.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, another one is, do you think that some of this stigma and shame is actually due to idiocentric individualistic values in society, and that maybe this experience is different in more allocentric collective values and cultures? Is some of this due to a lack of community with other women?
Hmm. I think so for sure. I would love to do a deep dive. I would like to write a book about that and go live in other countries and cultures and actually find out. But yes, I do think that it probably is very much rooted in the fact that we are living in, an individualistic, patriarchal society that is so focused on go, 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 achieve, 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 and leaves so little room for grief. I'm imagining that other cultures and even maybe countries I visited and potentially other religions actually can sit with grief, honor grief, uh, you know, in much more sort of profound and slow ways.
I
And oh,
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry, I wanted to add to that. I think that's definitely accurate that our grief here is some benefits to give you 3 days, right? They're like, oh, there's a 3-day bereavement leave because your parent died, and now right? Like that's just so absurd to me. As somebody who belongs to a collectivist culture and lives in an individualistic culture, I can definitely say that there are differences in the way grief is tolerated and viewed in many cultures. There's so much more integration in like spirituality in the day to day. Like if you grow up in a Muslim collectivist country, like that idea of like we all return to God but belong to the universe and continuity, that's just part of your day to day. So it's like visualized differently. I know that other cultures have very particular rituals around grief. Like, so we, like in the Muslim South Asian background, have like a 3-day, 7-day, 30-day, 45-day, and then 90-day gathering post someone's passing to continuously go in as a community and check on people. So I think that that is true. But also, the more collective you are, the more you have to stay in line. So if your grief is making you fall out of line in some way or
Yeah.
weakening the family system in some way, it can be heavily punished. So it's not that one culture is better than the other. I think it's just the way they both interact with it, and the rules and rituals around it are different.
Yeah, and this for question two kind of speaks to that. And Jessica, maybe, so the question is, some of our collective experience of shame and stigma might be rooted in intergenerational trauma. And I know, being a Jewish person, and I know Jessica is as well, there's obviously a lot of that. And same in most cultures, there's obviously some sort of generational trauma and in individual families. So the question, well, he cited Resma, who talks about that and trauma and physiological experiences. So, how do you think generational trauma also plays into the shame and stigma surrounding everyday experiences?
I can
Who's
go.
speaking? You
Yeah.
want
I can go. I could talk about this all day. My God. Someone just said this is a great topic. Absolutely. So intergenerational trauma absolutely is like so powerful, but so is intergenerational resilience. And you're right, that's a lot of like the symptomology is sometimes blamed on like current day situations. But current day situations also have a lot of impact in making you feel better. So while yes, like intergenerational trauma and epigenetic trauma can definitely show up and most certainly does in collective experiences. I think that your current day coping skills also matter in helping overcome that. And the reason I say that is, in my therapy practice, when this kind of stuff comes up, I find that a lot of my clients feel very disempowered by the narrative that the intergenerational trauma is seeped into my bones. So now I can't do anything about it. Like this is now my destiny because of something that happened to my parents and my grandparents, right? So I think shifting it also to include, we're not ignoring it, but we're also including the current day physiological experiences that we can influence and change to improve how we feel in the midst of this is very empowering.
Thank you, Israa. We actually had a question come in about end to late pregnancy or having to end a late pregnancy for medical reasons. I had to terminate a pregnancy at 26 weeks. and still after a long time, still feeling the shame of that because they agreed to terminate. Jessica, do you want to take that
Oh,
on?
yes. Yes. I did, of course, include termination for medical reasons in Normalize It because I am incredibly passionate about this topic. Unfortunately, I have seen over the course of the last decade that a lot of people in the pregnancy loss community somehow don't want to include people who terminate because they see it as a quote unquote choice and it becomes politicized. And then they are relegated to a stigma that hurts all the more. And being in a position where you have to sort of tell the doctor, yes, I've decided to terminate, not because it's an unwanted pregnancy, but because something is wrong with the baby and or it is going to end the mother's life, in my opinion, should not be something that we whisper about. I think like anyone who wants to get on a rooftop about this or share in whatever way they feel is safe and they feel they can is so potentially impactful because women are, I mean, and even in the media, a lot of celebrities say they had a miscarriage when in fact they did not. Um, because it's sort of a more digestible loss than this idea of opting to terminate, which of course, again, I always put in quotes that it's a choice because when we're faced with a life threatening situation, is it a choice? It's the most compassionate choice you could ever make for yourself and your unborn child. So, I work a lot with people who terminate, and I include in my first book that I myself would have terminated for medical reasons had I not had my miscarriage.
Yeah, I think you're entirely accurate in everything you just said there. I've had friends who've gone through that and, it's never spoken about, at least publicly. And yeah. So we have just about a few minutes left. So I wanted to give you both a couple of minutes to maybe put a little plug in for your books and where to find you and follow you. You both have enormous Instagram communities where you're constantly posting really great stuff, tips. Israa, I know you have a Substack. So Israa, if you want to go first, and then Jessica, and then we'll just kind of wrap it up.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And, this conversation is so important to continue having. My book is called Toxic Productivity. That's what it looks like. It's available everywhere books are sold. So indie bookshops, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, all the things. My work is really centered on helping people improve their own emotional awareness. That requires emotional regulation, emotional nervous system regulation, just emotional vocabulary. I think that's like really important to me because I think that the more we arm people with mental health information, similar to what Jessica was saying in the beginning, it becomes protective for our health and in some way preventative. So trying to make sure people have access to information and education, understand what's going on with them, so they can catch something before it becomes a bigger problem. And I'm pretty active on Instagram, so you can definitely follow me there. And my Substack is a place where I just like to write long form essays about mental health and, engage with people in a totally different way.
I need to sign up. I can be found on Instagram at I Had a Miscarriage, and my website is drjessicazucker.com. And my book comes out April 22nd. So pre ordering now would be ideal. And I can't believe it's less than 2 weeks away. And you can get it on Amazon, bookshop.org, Porchlight, everywhere books are sold. You can also pre order from indie bookstores as well.
Yeah, thank you both. And I just want to point out too, because especially on Instagram, and you both have big followings, there's a lot of those, sidewalk therapists who are giving a lot of not accurate advice, especially for those who aren't actually trained therapists who haven't done the work that these two women have. So they're great communities to follow and people to follow because it's real advice and not something just kind of made up from a wellness influencer. So these are two really great follows. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone who is on today. For everyone who is registered for the event, you do have archival access that'll be out soon. And we'll probably try to get this up on YouTube as well so people can access it at any time. But yes, pre-order the books, follow everyone on Instagram, and thank you so much for joining today. This was really nice and a really meaningful conversation.